Okay, I've been wanting to do this for a while. One of my real classics, Empires of the Middle Ages. A fairly light treatment, at least compared to Europa Universalis, of the medieval period in Europe. I'm going to play the full campaign game, I think. There are some definite questions with that. I don't think it's the best game, and I don't think it's the best. It's certainly not the best historical simulation available within the game. However, it seems like the needed thing to do when you play this, especially solitaire. I found it's a good game in conventions to play the shorter scenarios or with small gaming groups. Nothing is really less than 6 to 8 hours, though, so it's not really accessible to your lighter gamers. The initial situation, you got Charlemagne ruling his Frankish kingdom. Now, let me explain a little bit about the board, counters, whatever. The board is divided into little areas that are interconnected. No big deal for people who are used to point system, because it's really pretty much the same thing except the boxes are a little bigger, in order to hold the counters and use them as sliders. Social state is the main counter on these, and that indicates how wealthy a country is. It can range from +4, really, down to -3. But each area is limited to no more than 2 higher than its base value. So there, we also have counters for claims, and some of these are stacked. Every single Frankish territory is claimed by Charlemagne. There's also fortresses, and again, a few territories have fortresses in them. I choose to keep them in stacks because it keeps the clutter down. It's pretty easy to remember who's got a fort, who doesn't. The other main player is the Byzantine player at this point. Now, the Byzantine player is very interesting in the Grand Campaign. Usually they're pretty much guaranteed to dominate the game throughout its course, in terms of not in terms of the actions that are going on, but in terms of their wealth and their power and their victory points. Every now and then I've seen them get drained, but because they're pretty much out of the conflict, at least once they leave Italy, which usually they're forced to do. They're not that powerful, especially at the early stages. Until they're forced out of Italy, though, they are a little involved, possibly against the Franks, but they're just in such a secluded area, and the Crusades come and threaten them a little bit, but never as much as historically happened, at least in the Grand Campaign. It might be different in some of the other scenarios. The only times I've played them, Crusades are unlikely, not the Crusades, but the Saracen advances. The Muslims are unlikely to become really a threat in any of the scenarios. The chance of one of such an action, of the conditions which cause a crusade happening, are actually a lot lower than I'd like them to be. The Mongols, on the other hand, could be a threat to the Byzantines, depending on how things channel. Also, each area has a little religion marker. It's kind of hard to distinguish them on the camera. Those are Catholic areas. Got a couple of markers, I think, for Eastern Orthodox areas down here in Italy. But we've got Macedonia and the Greek areas are Eastern Orthodox. Got some pagan markers. Basically everything east of here is pagan, even if they don't have markers, so Bohemia is pagan. And we got Muslims over in Spain. The Muslims in Spain are kind of interesting. In particular, they don't resist very hard, which is to say, if the Reconquista is happening at any level, if you conquer an area as a Catholic player, it becomes a Catholic area. All right, so what happens in this particular scenario? This part of it, this phase, is going to last 9 turns, or 9 rounds. I believe that's less than 2 turns. And then Charlemagne will automatically die. What that means, what happens in the Grand Campaign, is Charlemagne's territory is then divided into 3 players who presumably are working together when they play in the campaign. But in conventions I've played this where a couple of us started as the Franks and the Byzantines, and then we seek to add players throughout the entire convention event. Never quite got the following I wanted for it. 4 or 5 players maximum at any one time. The final number over there is the upper right corner is the population value. And if that's positive, it means it takes multiple attempts to conquer an area. Population also affects things like pillaging, so negative values have some effect actually on the game. The colors of all the different territories is sort of their base language color. So you have sort of a Spanish language color, a Southern French and Eastern Iberian language, Northern French language, several Germans, a couple of Italian languages, etc., and many Slavics. Those colors aren't exactly correct at this point, and this is actually one of a couple of modifications I'm going to make to the game, which I'll explain in a bit. But, for example, Brandenburg starts the game Slavonic. Now, there's a rule for converting territories, but that rule doesn't allow some of the conversions that happened. So, for example, Wallachia becoming Romanian, essentially, speaking Vlach, is something that cannot happen in the game because you have to convert language groups from languages that they are. So some language conversions, in particular that one, the Hungarians get to stay the same. The Bulgarians probably aren't going to be, nobody's going to make them into Slavics. Brandenburg, nobody's going to make Brandenburg into Old High Saxon. That's actually a miscolored. It looks the same as the rest of Germany. It's not. Saxony and Brandenburg have a different language group slightly. There are also language families, which are based on color similarity as it is. And here's kind of everything in one grouping is one family. So you have the Romance languages, you have the Germanic languages, the Slavic languages, and everything else is pretty much on its own. Religion and language are big differentiators. It's very hard to rule or do anything from an area that's of a different, or to an area that's of a different language or religion than yours. And that's kind of an important factor in the game. Okay, so let's go back to what happens at the end of this part of the scenario in the campaign game. What happens here is that, like I said, the Franks will end up splitting into 3 players. The Byzantines get to keep their same position. There's room for 2, and in my set, I made a homemade little set of counters. 3 additional players, because one scenario actually holds 7. That's why those counters exist. So I'm going to play with up to 7 players. If at any time, and right at the beginning of the game this is the case, there are 3 adjacent areas of one language group that are all Christian and aren't controlled by anyone, they can form into their own little kingdom. And at the beginning of the game, both the English and the Celts are in this position. And that's kind of weird, but making them both be able to be players once this part of the scenario is done isn't really that big a deal because they fight each other. if England's allowed to be free on its own there's a good chance that they will dominate the game. Italy can also become such, but chances are somebody will have grabbed the claims that they have in Italy and prevent that from happening. Also, the game has a good deal of rules in terms of total quantity, but the actual mechanics are fairly simple, which is why I say it's a fairly light game. All right, let's go to the specific changes that I put in play, which is really probably only important to somebody who's familiar with it. One is the rules indicate that diplomatic ties have a lot of influence on your ability to tax a country and on its unrest value rolls. I've extended that to include claims. The main reason is that if somebody else claimed a territory, that area would be more vulnerable to unrest. And likewise, to some extent, claims reduce the unrest that peasants had. So ties become just lesser claims under that setup. I've always played this way. I have some debates about it because it does create more money, essentially. But the game, even playing with this, most people who've played it have complained, I can't do anything. I spend my whole life trying to quell the unrest that I caused by trying to get a couple bucks. And that's true for everyone except the Byzantines. It might neuter the Byzantines' money capability a little bit. Another option that I've added is about the money itself. The countermix for money is not supposed to be limited. I've declared that it is. And if you have to take, if you get to take money and there's none left, you take it from the richest player. That prevents hoarding to a little bit extent. Hoarding is a big problem in the game, especially with the Byzantines. They're able to basically pile up as much money as they like and use it all in one big swoop. Historically, that just didn't happen. There's no way to prevent it completely, but it's one of the problems I have with the game. The game is driven by these year cards. Each time you conduct an action, you determine what happens by flipping over a card and seeing what the effects are. And by the way, this entire system got moved over for Sorting the Stars, which is a game I don't like anywhere near as much, but it uses almost entirely the same system. You get 5 of these, and you have to pay to do actions, and there's values that are computed, etc. But these are pretty much the randomizers. And it's kind of a neat little system. I don't know how much it adds to the game. And then there's event cards, some of which you can hold, and some of which are play immediately cards. And they have a series of different effects on the game. Some of them, like the recognition of claim or dynastic inheritance, are more political in nature. Some, like a year of famine, are just straight events that reduce the social state of all the territories listed. The goal of the game is largely, and this is especially in the smaller scenarios, to control a lot of territory. You get points for each area you control. It has to be valuable territory. You get 3 points for the area plus the social state. So if the social state's -3, it's useless. You get 3 points for an area you own with a claim in it. So owning areas that you have a right to is important. And then there's a few additionals that usually don't take place except in the campaign game, which are, for example, converting the language of an area is worth 5 victory points, or converting the religion of an area is worth 5 victory points. We'll go a little bit more into things as we go along. I think I've spoken way too much already, but this is one of my longtime favorites. When I first bought it, well, I didn't get to buy it. I went to the Complete Strategist and they were out. And the guy there asked, is there some sort of convention for this? Because we've had like 3 people this week ask for it. Nobody's ever asked for it. As soon as I first saw it in S&T, I wanted this game. I knew I wanted it. And I spent over a year looking for it. Eventually, some guy in California I knew sent it to me for Christmas, a family friend. And it was really one of the best presents I've ever gotten. This is back when I'm like 16 years old or something. And I've treasured it since then. I know that there are some recent modifications to it. I remember in the mid-aughts seeing some and thinking they may actually add something to the game, but I didn't want to modify my components and or come up with a whole new board. So I'm pretty much sticking with the original. They didn't seem to modify it significantly. There's also I think a kind of online variant for it. One hopes someday they reprint this either slightly modified or in the original form. It certainly goes for a hell of a lot and is well received in a lot of sectors.